My name is Tobias Roberts. I'm originally from the United States, but I've lived here in Central America for the past 20 years or so. I worked for 10 years with different small-scale nonprofit development organizations, both on a small grassroots level and also on a wider regional level. And then about 10 years ago, my family and I kind of became a bit disillusioned with the whole world of development and decided to leave that world and start a small farm. I did a lot of work mostly in agricultural development, working with peasants, small farmers, indigenous populations. And we decided that we wanted to kind of try out that lifestyle instead of, prescribing solutions to small scale farmers. We wanted to see if what we thought was true. So for the past 10 years now, we have a small farm. We live in a rural community in the mountains of El Salvador, where my wife is from. And we participate in different cooperatives. We have an ecotourism collective and also a small scale organic production initiative together with our neighbors. Um, if any of you have participated in past classes that I've shared, you'll probably know that a lot of my focus on critiques of development are focused on empowering small scale, landed groups of people. So, really about returning to the land, empowering small scale farmers, foresters, people who are directly involved with what many people might call land-based economies. And I think yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about that this morning, but about maybe 2 months ago, I had a student from AIU in our Spanish class that reached out to me, sent me an email, and said that she was really interested in a lot of these themes, but she lived in an urban environment where obviously land is not available enough, especially to to farm or to be involved in forestry. And she said, how can the same kind of ethics, the same morals, the same kind of guiding principles that you lay out for returning to the land, empowering local agrarian economies, how can that be applied in an urban or suburban context, especially in areas where people, for their livelihoods, depend on manufacturing, industry, business? And that got me thinking a lot about the role of small scale manufacturing. Obviously, the necessities of life that we need, food, water, clothing, shelter, a lot of those are dependent on direct uh, contact with the land. So people who grow our food, people who take care of the trees that allow springs of water uh, to give us the water that we need, lumber that we use for building, etc. Um, but food, water, and shelter are not the only human needs, right? Obviously, all of us today are wearing clothes. Clothes have to be manufactured from things. Um, and as it stands, as we're going to look at today, the vast majority of commerce, of industry, of manufacturing has been globalized, especially in the last 100 years or so. And we're going to talk a little about why that is. And I want to make the argument in today's class that the globalized takeover of manufacturing, of industry, of commerce has come at an enormous cost to local economies, to people who live in placed areas. Despite the fact that people who believe in globalization and large-scale corporate manufacturing will say that their method, their methodology, is the only way to ensure that goods are produced at scale, that those goods are transported around the world to where they're needed, that nations should completely give in to this idea of comparative advantage, which essentially means that, if El Salvador is good at producing mangoes and coffee, then we should just produce mangoes and coffee and, sell that on the global market, create capital investiture, and reinvest that purchasing things that we need from other countries. Um, what I'm going to argue in today's class, as you see, it's called Commoning Diversity in Small Scale Manufacturing. What I want to discuss in this class, yeah, let me see if I can get this moving. Okay, is essentially that it is extremely important that we understand that every economic activity that humanity participates in is a land-based activity. And I want to talk, I think that's important for us to think about. We're going to look a little bit to the thought of certain economists. Ecological economics is kind of a branch of traditional economics that encourages us to think a little bit more deeply about some of the economic assumptions that we have. Next, I want to look at the precarious nature of the six-continent supply chain, of the globalized economy as we have it today. Look at some of the vulnerabilities that we're currently facing within this kind of this economic paradigm that has come to dominate the vast majority of the world around the world. And then I want to make the argument, kind of, I guess you would say the counter argument, that small scale manufacturing that's controlled by local people, local regions, that uses resources that are sourced locally, that uses local labor, and that is ultimately sold in a local region, is much more efficient, is much more capable at producing items that humanity needs, is much more capable at improving access to dignified jobs and employment for people, and that it also can produce and manufacture goods in a way that is in harmony with the local ecosystem, with the natural world, etc. And then I guess tied to that is we're going to take a quick look at the relationship between small scale processing, production, manufacturing, and the important values of resiliency and adaptability, especially in the world in which we're living today. And lastly, as the title of this class talks, I think it's important to understand the roles of diversity and the commons in small scale manufacturing. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me make this a little bit bigger so we can see here. Okay. So, as I said at the beginning, everything starts with the land. If you look at these graphs over here to the right, let me move this out of the way. Neoclassical economics, which is what every economist, anybody who studies economy or economics at the local university, will essentially understand and be taught economic theory that's based on this tiny little map, this tiny little graph here to the right, which essentially shows that all of our social systems, all of humanity, all of the social sphere, the environment, the resources that we use, the ecosystem services provided by nature are encapsulated by the economy. The economy is kind of seen as this all-encompassing thing, system where everything else is substrate to that. Everything else is subservient to the economy. And about 30 or 40 years ago, there were several people who were trained in neoclassical economics, among them a guy named Herman Daly, who looked at this kind of graph, this assumption of neoclassical economics that all of the social sphere, that all of the environment was essentially subservient or consumed by the economic realm. And he said, well, actually, that makes absolutely no sense, right? It's impossible for there to be economic growth. It is impossible for there to be any economic activity without people, obviously, workers, people who invest their labor and their time and their creativity and their energy. But even greater than that, without the environment, without materials, without energy, without the ability for the environment to access our waste and process our waste in a healthy way, without all of these things and services that the environment, that ecology provides us with, economic growth doesn't happen. Any economic activity doesn't happen. And what it's kind of, it makes common sense, right? That you can't have economic growth without material throughput. Material throughput comes from resources from the earth that are mined, that are transformed, that are manufactured, that are distributed. But one of the main problems in neoclassical economics is that we essentially assumed that the environment was always going to be there, right? To the point that we ignored it. And for the vast majority of the last 300 years of industrial economic output, we could do that because the world was so large. It seemed to have this enormous, endless supply of materials, and goods and raw materials for us, that, it seemed that no matter how much coal or oil we took from the earth and burned it, we really didn't know what was happening. We didn't know much about climate change, until relatively recently in historical terms. We didn't ever think that we could deplete, the resources that we depended on. That, eventually people knew that, copper or steel or aluminum or any other material, a certain mine might run out, but we always assumed that we would continue to find more and more and more. As we say, modern day economists tend to forget or ignore that the economy is necessarily a subset of the wider social system in the biosphere. Without a functional environment, there is no economic growth. Only in recent years have we begun to discover that we do now have the capability to fundamentally alter the biosphere, right? That we are depleting resources, that our contamination is causing very real effects, in climate change and topsoil loss, contamination, plastics in our ocean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Herman Daly, who was one of the first ecological economicists, came up with this, looked at this graph and he said, no, it's completely wrong. It has to be the other way around. The economy, all of the economic activity, all of the goods that we produce, the services that we offer, the profit that our companies and our individuals and our businesses make, all of that has to be subservient to the environment, to the biosphere, and also to, the well-being of the social sphere of humanity as a whole. We can't think that economics can grow, can advance at the cost of the environment in which we live. Because if we come to a point where the environment is no longer able to provide us with the goods that our globalized economy demands, or if the externalities, the negative ecological effects of our consumption, of our production, of our waste, start to cause very, very real consequences, then economic growth, economic activity is going to come to a halt. Herman Daly, in his one of his famous books, says the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the reverse. There is something fundamentally wrong in treating the earth as if it were a business in liquidation. From this basic vantage point of ecological economics, every economic activity is part of a land-based economy. And we need to think about the environmental costs, the externalities, and the footprint of that economic output. Because of globalization, because of the fact that, everything we use, from this pen that I have here to these scissors that my children are using in their art class today, most of us have no idea. We don't even think about what were the resources that were involved in the production, in making this. Like this little pen here has plastics. It has some sort of synthetic tint. It has some small metal pieces. Who knows what else, right? I have absolutely zero relationship with where these plastics were made, where the oil was extracted from, where the tint came from. I have no idea. It's simply beyond my mindset because of the distance, because of the complexity of supply chains, because of globalization, right? And because of that, when I look at a pen, when I think about the economic output of a pen, I really can't make the connection to the land. However, without the extraction mining of oil, without the extraction mining of other resources, this pen would never exist, right? So we tend to think of economic activity as divorced from land-based activities, whether it be mining, whether it be forestry, whether it be fishing, whether it be agricultural activity. However, every economic activity, every sale of a thing, of a service, is inevitably tied to the land, right? We need to understand that land-based economies, are the very basis of every economic activity. Here in El Salvador, we've gained some international reputation because for a while, at least, Bitcoin was our national currency. And I remember when there was this discussion, a lot of people looking like El Salvador is really doing great economically because our government is buying a bunch of Bitcoin and the price of Bitcoin is going up. And there was an article that said this is a great way to decouple or decouple means kind of delink economic growth from the local ecosystem. And the article made the point that, in the past, El Salvador's economic growth was dependent upon the land, right? So we would mine gold, we would grow coffee, we would, grow mangoes and export them to the north. And the argument said that, by having our economy tied to the land, we're at a disadvantage because the land can only give so much. And now that our economic growth is tied to something as ephemeral as Bitcoin, we can continue to grow, essentially, without any sort of limitation. And you think about that, well, even Bitcoin, which is this, essentially artificial creation of a financial asset, is 100% dependent on land-based things, right? Even though it's something that's invented, to mine Bitcoin requires an enormous amount of energy. Energy comes from the land, whether it be fossil fuels, whether it be solar energy. If we're creating mining Bitcoin from solar energy, then we're doing so by creating, by mining lithium for the batteries, silica for the solar panels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing is divorced or separated from the land eventually, right? A commitment to honesty in how our economic activity affects the land should place high value on those people and communities and places and territories who are in direct contact with the land through land-based economic activities at the base of the economic pyramid. Essentially, if you look at this little pyramid here, this is kind of an example of how most people conceive of the economy. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and 487 other billionaires who account for pretty close to 50% of economic activity around the world, or at least of economic wealth. I mean, are at the very tip of the pyramid. These are kind of the people we want to emulate. Then there's 10 million millionaires at the top. Then there's 620 million wealthiest consumers, 10% of the global consumers, most of whom live in the United States and Europe, Japan, and certain pockets of the global West. And then there's about 30% of global consumers who are reached by multinational corporate enterprise, right? Those who are the beneficiaries of this global economic behemoth that we have created. People who are able to purchase things from the six continent supply chains. But what we forget is at the base of this economic pyramid are 4 billion people, communities around the world who are not yet reached by multinational corporations, people who still subsist in, what a lot of people think of in derogatory terms as subsistence economies, whether it be small scale farmers, small scale industry, local economies, right? And in traditional economic thought, the idea is that these 4 billion people need to move up the pyramid. The idea is that, if they can at least move into this second section here, they'll be able to purchase things, that are supplied by the global multinational corporate enterprise. Here in the country where I live in El Salvador, there's, in the last 2 or 3 years, people are extremely happy because now El Salvador has kind of opened up to the world of online e-commerce. So now you can purchase things on Amazon, and Amazon will ship it to El Salvador. Temu, which is the Chinese low cost online purchasing website, and so people in El Salvador feel that this is something that's very positive. We're moving up into this area of where we have greater access to online goods, to this global economic purchasing power pyramid type of thing. However, if we are going to look at, like I said, how the economy should be a subset of the biosphere upon which it depends, instead of trying to push everybody up the pyramid. In the end, what do we want? We want a world of 8 or 10 billion, Bill Gates or Elon Musk's. No, what we need to understand is that we need to place real value on the people who are at the base of the pyramid, instead of trying to move them out of that, trying to understand that without this base, of people and communities and regions that work in tandem with the local ecosystem to produce goods, then the economy simply doesn't work. Wendell Berry, one of my favorite authors and a farmer himself, says that whether we and our politicians know it or not, nature is party to all our deals and decisions, and she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do. Let's see if I can change this. Hold on just a second. It's not changing. Okay. Um, as it stands, like I said, the nature of our six continent supply chains. Here's a few statistics for us to think about. About a quarter of all food produced for human consumption is internationally traded. In the global north, in the United States, Europe, certain parts of Asia, that isn't that number is much higher, closer to 75%. The 25% takes into account that there are still large pockets of the world where the food that is consumed is mostly produced and distributed locally. However, in terms of the clothes that we wear, about 90% of the clothes sold in the United States are manufactured overseas. Over 90% of the electronics that we use are produced in countries different from where they're ultimately consumed. The computer that I'm using, the cell phones that you all might be connecting on, are made not in one place, but on several different continents. The chips might be made in Taiwan, the plastics sourced from oil that was taken out of the ground in Kuwait, put together in a factory in Vietnam or China. The processors might have been made in Europe, the United States. Even one simple product, such as a phone or computer, depends on this extremely complex six-continent supply chain. A recent report that looked at how healthy global supply chains are in the globalized economy found that only 6% of businesses achieved full supply chain visibility. That means, for example, I have a Dell computer. Dell has, they rely on parts from all over the world, but it's mo very probable that even they don't know where all of the things that they use, that they require to put together this computer, they don't know where it comes from. They don't understand the social conditions of the people who worked in the mines, the people who put together certain things. They don't understand some of the ecological externalities or negative effects that happen because of that. Only 6% of businesses know where the things that they require actually come from. Fewer than 8% of businesses believe they have full control over their supply chain risks, and 63% report higher than expected losses, evidence of the ongoing unpredictability and complexity of the global supply chain. Geopolitical uncertainties, raw material shortages, global tariffs, energy scarcities, and cybercrime are just a few of the challenges, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic started to unravel this very, very tight six continent supply chain. Many businesses are, even big multinational corporations, are trying to reduce their dependence on this massively complex global supply chains. People are understanding, even multinational corporations like Dell, understand that it makes much more economic sense. It's much safer to try and create much reduced or smaller, better controlled supply chains. Over 90% of transportation today is fueled by oil, and transportation accounts for almost two-thirds of the oil used worldwide. About 30% of total energy consumption around the world goes towards transporting both people and goods. Though we talk a lot about the energy transition that we're coming to rely on, on solar panels and wind and whatever it is, especially heavy transportation, so trucks, cargo ships, planes, etc., are going to be 100% dependent on essentially oil. Diesel oil and bunker oil is what is necessary. It provides the strength of the energetic needs to move heavy things, whether it be airplanes, whether it be ships, whether it be trucks, right? What we have noticed is that the energy returned on energy invested, which is known as EROI for fossil fuels and especially for oil, is drastically plummeting with serious effects for the transportation and cargo industries. What that means, if you take a look at this graph here, second, is that if we get 100 megajoules of oil from a an oil well somewhere in the Middle East or in Venezuela or in Alaska or wherever it might be, about 10 megajoules of that is lost during the extracting process. Another 27 megajoules is lost during the refining process. Another 5 megajoules is lost during the transportation of the oil. Uh, um, 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 and then the infrastructure for transport, the roads, the shipping lanes, the ports, et cetera, creates another 37.5 megajoules. So the oil that remains as consumer-ready fuel is only about 20 megajoules. So when we look at that, that means we have about a 20 to 80 energy returned on energy investment. If you go back maybe 50 to 100 years, the EROI for oil was about it was much higher. It was maybe like 90 to 10. So you would extract 100 barrels of oil, and about 90 would be left over for use. Today, that number is at about 20, and reports say that in the coming 10 to 15 years for oil, that might reduce to about between 6 and 10. So it's not that there isn't oil available, it's that the oil that's available, the oil that we absolutely need to transport goods in a global economic system is becoming much, much more expensive to extract, to transport, and to make available to people. Another drawback of the industrialized manufacturing system that characterizes economic globalization is that it is incredibly rigid and unflexible. For example, a farmer who purchases a $1.5 million combine, a huge tractor that is specifically built to only work with monocultures of wheat, will be economically unable to adapt his farming methods if that becomes necessary. This might seem like a theoretical example, but I know farmers in the United States, people who, in where I grew up in Kentucky, bought into the idea that bigger is better. And they invested enormous amounts of money in purchasing this huge machinery. In where I live, where I grew up at in the United States, it wasn't wheat, it was corn. And what many of them are finding is that the price of corn has plummeted so much on a global scale that it's economically infeasible to continue to grow it. So many farmers are moving, especially in Kentucky where I grew up, are moving away from corn production or want to at least. But the problem is that they have this massive machinery that costs over $1 million that can only do one thing, and that is harvest corn. And so, in order to diversify, in order to change their farming methods to try and find more profitable crops, they have to find a way to sell a $1.5 million tractor. The problem is that not everybody wants to buy a $1.5 million tractor. So a farmer who buys into the extremely specialized kind of economic niches that kind of characterize this global economic system in which we live, are completely inflexible. They're stuck in this rigid kind of niche that doesn't allow them to respond to the conditions, right? Similarly, a farmer that's growing wheat, there's a lot of, discussion. What happens if, there's this massive pathogen outbreak and we're not able to grow wheat or rice or one of the other industrial crops? The farmers who have invested all of their money and their creativity and their time in this one specific niche are going to be unable to really adapt. Similarly, a textile manufacturing industry that has millions of dollars in machinery that is designed to only work with one certain type of polyester fiber, for example, will be economically inhibited from shifting its production techniques if, for example, rising oil prices make it unfeasible to continue relying on synthetic fibers. Polyester and several other synthetic textiles that we use for our clothes, come from oil. What happens if the price of that input, of that raw material, becomes so expensive that these textile mills and manufacturing centers, want to shift to, let's say, wool or cotton or flax or some other natural type of fiber. The problem is that because of the specialization of the machinery, they would have to essentially throw away millions of dollars of the machines that they use to purchase others. So another problem with this globalized economic system is that it creates rigidity and a lack of flexibility. Um, In comparison, there are several advantages to small scale manufacturing. Those of us who grew up in the world of globalization, sometimes it's hard for us to understand that because we tend to have been sold the idea that bigger is better. That the larger you are, the more comparative advantage you're going to have, the importance of economies at scale. However, if we really took a moment to think about how small scale manufacturing practices can be incredibly resilient, especially in the vulnerabilities of the polycrisis of ecological, social, geopolitical crises that we're facing. Here are just some of the advantages that small scale manufacturing might offer. First, limited capital investment. Small scale manufacturing enterprises obviously require less initial investment compared to large scale industries. This tends to limit the need for outside or absentee investors and to cement control and ownership in the hands of either the small business owner or the workers themselves, right? If you're going to start a small scale, again, us talk about textile, a small scale textile factory that you hope to employ maybe 10 to 15 workers, you might be able to get a small loan without selling off equity in your company to some massive business conglomerate. Um, Small scale manufacturing is also labor intensive. Many small scale industries rely heavily on manual labor. The smaller scale of the manufacturing allows for the creative use of convivial tools, right? We're going to talk about what convivial tools are, but essentially, convivial tools allow people to use the tool for their own creative purposes. Again, the farmer who purchases a $1.5 billion combine tractor that can only do one thing, that's not a convivial tool. In order to use that tool, the farmer has to essentially enslave himself to the tool and to the economic system that created that tool, right? Another advantage is a local or regional focus. Small scale manufacturing often serve local or regional markets. Things that are made not to be sold, on the other side of the world, but to be sold in your locality, in your community, in your state, in your country, right? If the product is necessarily export oriented, for example, coffee here in Central America, the necessary manufacturing is kept as local as possible. I have a small coffee farm, and one of the things that I've kind of learned over the past couple of years is that so much coffee is produced in El Salvador that Salvadorans would never be able to drink all of it. At the same time, there's an enormous demand for coffee. People love it. And there's billions of cups of coffee drinking every morning. So yeah, coffee does need to be exported. The problem is that here in El Salvador, most people, the vast majority of the market is oriented towards exporting, what we call green coffee beans. And then it's purchased by these what are known as specialty roasters in the United States. And the specialty roaster says that they offer a very, very important aspect of the supply chain of the process of making coffee. And they might purchase coffee at $2 a pound. And after roasting it, they sell it at 10, 15, $20 a pound. What the roasters essentially do is take the raw beans, put them into some machines, touch some buttons, and then bag it. Um, that's not necessarily something that requires an enormous amount of knowledge or wisdom. And so there's a huge movement amongst coffee growers here in El Salvador to band themselves together to create roasting technologies that they themselves can operate, right? So instead of exporting the raw product itself, transform that product into a higher value added product that can then be exported. Another advantage of small scale manufacturing is that it tends to be much more flexible and has the ability to adapt to changing conditions. Small scale manufacturing is more flexible and adaptable to changing conditions in the economic and environmental arenas. For example, going back to our textile example, a small scale textile mill could potentially shift its production from synthetic fibers to wool or flax fibers if supply chains interrupted polyester production and local farmers started to increase flax or wool production. And lastly, small scale manufacturing can be run from homes or small scale factory spaces, thus drastically limiting overhead startup costs, right? You don't have to buy or invest in a multi-million dollar factory for smaller scale manufacturing practices. Ivan Illich talks a lot about convivial tools. His definition is that convivial tools are those which give each person or group of people who uses them the greatest opportunity to enrich the environment with the fruits of his or her vision, right? Convivial tools are tied to maximum freedom for the economic agent, for the person, for the community, right? The opposite again of a convivial tool is one that imposes upon the producer, upon the business owner, upon the farmer, whoever it might be, what they can do with it. Again, the textile business owner who purchases a very, very specific type of machine that can only do one thing is going to be tied to that, right? Is going to be absolutely enslaved to a globalized economy that requires of them certain things. A convivial tool, however, allows people to use it to enrich the world with his or her own economic vision. Similarly, Wendell Berry says, an economy that's genuinely local and neighborly offers to localities a measure of security that they cannot derive from a national or a global economy controlled by people who, by principle, have no local commitment, right? When local manufacturing is controlled by people that we know, our neighbors, our friends, our family, people who we interact with every day, that creates a sense of security in the sense that we know them, we can exercise a certain amount of control and influence over them. We can't control or influence how Temu or Amazon or Microsoft or whoever it might be, how they treat their workers, what are some of the negative economic externalities of their business practices, right? That's kind of beyond the scope of the average person. Lastly, in economic terms, small-scale manufacturing, when deployed at large regional levels, tends to strengthen local economies, increase job opportunities, and keep capital flowing within the economic region instead of flowing outwards towards centers of wealth and power. The more small-scale manufacturing businesses, industries that there are in a region, the more that money, that capital, can flow in a circular manner around the locality, right? When we have these large vertical businesses and corporations. What tends to happen is that they come into a business, into an area, a region, they extract the materials, they extract, the knowledge, the manpower, they extract the wealth, and essentially that wealth gets concentrated into areas of wealth and power. In ecological terms, local production and manufacturing will allow communities to see, feel, and experience the effects of those manufacturing enterprises, thus allowing for greater control and regulation of unwanted externalities of those manufacturing processes. Externality is an important economic term that means a cost or benefit caused by an economic actor that is not suffered or enjoyed by that same actor, right? What we tend to have in the globalized economic system is that externalities are outsourced to the people who live in those areas, while the companies themselves take advantage of the benefits, right? The profits that are made. When small scale industry and manufacturing is connected to a local region, for example, if I live in an area, I live in a forest essentially up on the top of El Salvador's highest mountain. If one of my neighbors starts to clear cut his forest, and the streams that I depend on for growing my food, for irrigating my crops, start to dry up, um, me and the rest of my neighbors are going to be upset about that. We can confront our neighbor. We can talk about the importance of protecting the resources we all depend upon, right? Because of the local nature of local manufacturing, that allows people to get involved, to exercise certain influence and control over bad actors in the community who are creating externalities. Um, Again, like I mentioned, small scale manufacturing tends to allow resiliency and adaptability in a way that large vertical globalized six continent supply chain manufacturing cannot. Leopold Kohr, who was an important thinker back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, he believed that wherever something is wrong, something is too big, right? And then he gives all of these really neat examples, right? So, if stars in the sky or atoms of their uranium disintegrate in spontaneous explosion, is not because their substance has lost its balance. It is because matter has attempted to expand. If the human body becomes diseased, as in cancer, it's because a cell or a group of cells has begun to outgrow its allotted narrow limits. If the body of a people becomes diseased with the fever of aggression, collectivism, massive idiocy, it is not because it has fallen victim to bad leadership. It is because human beings, so charming as individuals or in small communities, have been welded into over-concentrated social units such as mobs, unions, or great powers. So this idea that right scale, the right size for certain things is extremely important, right? The bonanza, or the one-time windfall of the fossil fuel era allowed us, humanity, to create an artificial aura of bigness, right? Though there have been real benefits to this in terms of technological and industrial innovation, this crisis of bigness, to use Aldo Leopold's words, or Leopold Kohr's words, has also led us into an unparalleled and novel state of vulnerability, a loss of local resiliency in our economic well being, and an annihilation of diversity in terms of our economic strategies for crafting livelihoods that fit the contours of the landscapes we inhabit. In the era of globalization, of bigness, of multinational corporations, every country has kind of been pressured into try to adapt local, regional, and national economies to fit the globalized model, right? We have this homogenous, hegemonous idea that economic health is essentially whichever economy tries to fit in. Is that the health of our manufacturing enterprises needs to mirror the ecological principles of health in our ecosystems. Um, in the idea of diversity, small scale adaptability, etc. Um, E.F. Schumacher, who was another thinker who was very important of the time, argued that profitability alone is not an adequate measure of whether something is economic or not. A new economics is needed that takes into account not only the profitability of a given activity, but also its effect upon people and the environment, including the resource base. A diverse, small scale manufacturing landscape will allow local industry to be resilient to the coming changes in the world and to adapt to the local economic, social, and environmental needs. And lastly, I think that a rediscovery of the commons will be an important and necessary part of expanding small scale manufacturing. In its simplest and most direct form, commoning, or the management of the commons, is an activation of community and its shared control over local resources. Redeveloping an ethics of the commons, a shared space that is actively governed by a group of people who depend on the health of a territory, will allow manufacturing processes to deliver economic health for local regions without the cascading negative effects and externalities that are so often associated with the industrial manufacturing realm. So the idea is that, in the age of globalization, we lived in this space where there was no management over local resources.